매일매일 운동하기를 실천하고 있는 동탄 왕호입니다. 쉬는 날이에요. 지금 오후 2시가 넘었습니다. 3시? 3시? 아침에는 그 해가 엄청 강했는데 지금 점점 흐려지고 있어요. 태풍이 올라오고 있어서 그런 것 같습니다. 자, 운동하겠습니다. 오늘 집에 있으면 진짜 영어 공부 절대 안 해요. 그래서 최대한 영어 동영상 동영상 강의 보면서 운동하겠습니다. 하루 종일 운동이나 해야지 이럴 때.
Violence, as we've seen, and the polls are reflecting that. Violence in cities like Kenosha, Portland, and Minneapolis has put a dent in public support for the Black Lives Matter movement. But still, 51% of respondents in that CNN poll still hold a favourable view. 38% do not. Joining me now is Paul Sarasic. He's chairman of the Department of Politics and International Relations at Youngstown State University. Professor, really appreciate your time. I wanted to talk about the president clearly counting on law and order messaging as a major pillar of the campaign. Polling would suggest his effort to reframe the race around that isn't working. I'm curious what your take is on whether that has legs as a political strategy.
Well, I think it might, and I don't think we're quite sure yet whether it isn't working. It's kind of early in this. Voters are just starting to pay attention, and this clearly is a theme. I think that's in the background, and I think the reactions of former Vice President Biden, going off to Kenosha shows that the Democrats are at least a little bit worried about this going ahead. That it could become, an issue that Trump can use to move some swing voters into his camp.
I mean, it is hard to remember another presidency that's been more chaotic, if we can put it that way. Why do you think politically his supporters have been so loyal? I mean, what is it that makes them ignore the chaos of the presidency and see positives?
Well, I think some of them want the chaos. I mean, remember, Trump ran as a disruptor in 2016, as somewhat of a bomb thrower. He appealed to voters who thought that the system as it was not dealing them a winning hand, and they wanted to shuffle the deck. And electing Donald Trump was kind of the ultimate shuffling of the deck. So they wanted that disruption. Now the question becomes, in 2020, do they want that same disruption, or things like COVID and the disruption we're seeing in the streets? Is that not what they bargained for in 2016?
It's important to say the vast majority of protests have been peaceful, but of course, as we all know, some have not. And it's interesting because there's been polling which shows public support for Black Lives Matter has actually waned in the wake of the violence that has happened in some places. Is Joe Biden doing enough to counter that narrative, and that things will somehow be worse under him?
Well, he's actually in kind of a difficult position because just as Donald Trump plays to his base all the time, Joe Biden has to also play to his base. And if you go back, we forgot about the primaries, but it was a divisive primary in the Democratic Party, between the sort of progressive wing led by Bernie Sanders and then the more moderate traditional wing with Joe Biden. So, clearly the Black Lives Matter movement is very, near and dear to the progressive side of the party. So he has to be careful not to sort of distance himself from Black Lives Matters as he wants to distance himself from the violence we're seeing in the street.
I guess one problem, you mentioned the coronavirus, I guess one problem the president has is the coronavirus, because it's one problem where he can't control the narrative. The virus does what it does, and it's difficult to massage the numbers. How much of a hurdle politically is COVID, do you think?
It's a big hurdle, and in part because it scares older voters. And those older voters traditionally vote Republican, and they supported Donald Trump very strongly in 2016. The danger is because if they think that the Trump administration has mishandled coronavirus and it's putting them at risk, that's not the disruption they wanted in 2016. So that's why Trump has to continue to sort of deal with that. And you saw it in his press conference today where he sort of talks about what he's done, what the administration has done, all the testing they're doing. So he can't just ignore that issue.
Yeah, yeah. Very briefly, what do you see happening in the next 60 days? I imagine it's going to be quite a ride.
Yeah, there's still a lot of events. There's still a lot of campaigning to go on. We've really been kind of frozen, and everything's been slowed down by this coronavirus. We're not seeing the rallies we thought we would see. We're starting to see those a little bit. All the commercials aren't out yet. The big event coming up is at the end of this month in Ohio. The debates where we see Trump and Biden go head to head. That this year, normally the debates I don't think matter that much, but this year they could matter, a great deal and perhaps swing the election enough, because even though Biden's ahead, he's not ahead that far in the all-important swing states, and that's what matters. We learned in 2016. You've got to win those swing states to win the Electoral College.
Yeah, very good point, Professor Paul Sarasic. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
A black man shot 7 times in the back by police in Kenosha, Wisconsin, made his first court appearance on Friday. The charges against Jacob Blake are unrelated to the police shooting incident, which left him paralyzed in the hospital. CNN's justice correspondent Shimon Prokupes has details for us from Kenosha, Wisconsin.
We got our first
계속하겠습니다.
Jacob Blake since
확실히
shooting, since
어제 진짜 잠 많이 자고 하니까
police. This was during a
체력이 좋네요.
appearance from his previous domestic incident case. He appeared from his hospital bed dressed in a shirt and tie. It was a short briefing that was held before a judge here in Kenosha County. That case was adjourned and he's due back in court in September. This is all as we await more information from investigators here, state investigators who are still looking into the shooting and the circumstances surrounding the decision. The state investigators have up to 30 days to reach their conclusions, and then those findings are given to the district attorney, who will ultimately decide if any of the officers will face charges. Shimon Prokupes, CNN, Kenosha, Wisconsin.
And in Rochester, New York on Friday, another face-off between protesters and police. This after video was released this week showing the arrest there in March of Daniel Prude, a black man who later died in police custody. Protesters could be heard shouting "Black Lives Matter," police ordering them to disperse and saying they were involved in an unlawful assembly. CNN's Paulo Sandoval with more on this case and a warning: his report does contain graphic video.
Well, we now know a little bit more about what led up to the death of Daniel Prude earlier this year. His brother Joe Prude telling me that he was the one initially called for police assistance back on March 23rd when he told officers that his brother was experiencing a mental episode, that he was suicidal, hallucinating, and high on PCP, that he took his brother back to his home, and that's when he actually left that house. And that's where the body camera video that's been shared by the Prude family picked things up here. Warning, the video is certainly not easy to watch. But in these images, you can see the 41-year-old Chicago man. He's naked, agitated, distraught, and spitting, according to police. In fact, one officer wrote in his report that the 41-year-old man claimed that he was infected with the COVID virus. So about 3 minutes into the video, officers use a mesh, a so-called spit sock, to keep him from spitting on the officers. Shortly thereafter, that's when Prude is then restrained, his head held down, and then about 11 minutes after the first officer arrives on the scene, that's when Prude appears to be unresponsive. He's loaded onto an ambulance, taken to a nearby hospital, where he dies days later. An autopsy report ruling that he died of suffocation, excited delirium, and an acute PCP intoxication. Since then, his family has been searching for answers, mainly to the question of why it's taken months to finally get their hands on this body camera video. And then on Friday, Rochester authorities basically doubling down with their claim that they were contacted by the New York City Attorney General's office, asking that they withhold any information and to keep any materials, including that body camera video, from actually being released, saying that it would potentially jeopardize the integrity of that AG's investigation that's ongoing. And then Friday, a spokesperson for the Attorney General's office saying that at no point did they ask the city to withhold any information, and said they were actually free to conduct an investigation of their own. And then we did hear from the president of the Rochester Police Union, defending the actions of this officer, saying that he had seen this video and said that he absolutely believes that at this point, based on what he saw there, that the officers followed their training word for word. But at the same time, it seems that there is an agreement here among many people in the community, including the union, members of the community, and even the mayor of the city, that perhaps that training actually needs a closer look whenever officers are responding to these kinds of calls. Paul Sandoval, CNN, Rochester, New York.
Now, Portland police are confirming that they were trying to arrest Michael Reinhold on second-degree murder charges on Thursday night when he was killed in what they call a confrontation with U.S. Marshals. They say Reinhold was wanted in the shooting death of Aaron J. Danielson during a protest in Portland last week. The U.S. Attorney General calling Reinhold, quote, a violent agitator, and said the streets were safer without him. Now, I was going to show you pictures here from surveillance video taken shortly before the shooting of Danielson. You see Danielson and another man walking along the sidewalk. Reinhold seems to be concealing himself around the side of a building as they pass. The two men were on opposite sides of the political divide and the protests. Now, we often hear about people recovering from COVID-19, but also about people with long-term symptoms months after they were infected and supposedly recovered. After the break, why we should all be paying much closer attention to this. Also, Russia's PR campaign for its coronavirus vaccine gets a boost from a major medical journal. We'll have the latest from Moscow. We'll be right back.
Matters most, so we'll never stop advancing ourselves to be ready for anything. BDMS, your trusted healthcare network.
Wherever you are in the world, Lotte is always close to you. Lotte will be with you throughout the world until the name Lotte is synonymous with friendship. Your lifetime friend, Lotte.
Sunday, a CNN exclusive. Democratic vice presidential nominee Senator Kamala Harris shares how she and Joe Biden will take on President Trump. What's their general election pitch? State of the Union, Sunday on CNN.
When you travel the world, make sure the world travels with you. Check in, log on, and get connected with all of the latest developments at your fingertips. CNN Partner Hotels. Connected to your world.
4 years of Trump.
This is a president who came to be a disruptor.
The highs,
His greatest success is in the judiciary.
the lows.
We'll go away, just stay calm.
He looked at
COVID-19 and backed away.
The unexpected.
This is what the end result is.
He acted like someone who was further emboldened.
You have to agree with him all the time?
Yes.
What could his second term bring? CNN special report. Fight for the White House. Donald Trump's presidency. Tuesday on CNN.
I'm Anna Stewart in the City of London, and this is CNN.
And welcome back. I'm Michael Holmes. You're watching CNN Newsroom. Appreciate your company. The coronavirus mortality rates do not tell the whole story, far from it. Even though they might seem low in certain countries, that doesn't mean that there aren't some serious long-term effects from the virus that we're just starting to learn about. Thousands of people around the world are saying that they're dealing with ongoing symptoms months after being diagnosed with COVID-19. They call themselves COVID long haulers. Some of the symptoms they describe include breathlessness, memory loss, extreme fatigue, ongoing headaches, brain fog, muscle pain and swelling joints. Dr. Dana McCarthy treats long hauler patients at Mount Sinai Hospital, and she joins me now from New York. Great to talk to you, Doctor. This growing attention is being paid to this issue of the long haulers. Just give us a sense of what people are going through, those that you're seeing.
Yes, so there is a confluence of symptoms that overwhelmingly have in it fatigue as one of them. Second would be this kind of heart rate variability. They have differences in heart rate when they're going from either lying down to standing up. Anytime they try to exert themselves, they are feeling that they have intolerance to that. It seems as if, I would say, kind of
16분.
before illness, they had an energy window that might have been this big, and now after illness, their energy window is much smaller. So their tolerance for either cognitive exertion or physical exertion becomes much less. And when they push past that balance, they become very symptomatic. And that could, like I said, be blood pressure changes, it could be headaches, it can be this feeling of fogginess, inability to concentrate, memory loss, anything to feeling sick again, sore throats, feeling like you have fever even though you don't.
And it goes on for a long time too. I mean, in many cases, weeks. I think a CDC study found 35% of people who tested positive had symptoms 2 to 3 weeks later. I've heard of people 2 to 3 months later.
Yeah, even longer. So our patients in New York, right? We were at the peak of acute illness in March, early April, and I'm now treating patients out this far, right, who are still very symptomatic. I mean, these are individuals who can't even work at this point in time and have been out on disability or are fighting to be out on disability.
It really is so worrying. I mean, the issue, of course, is it's a new virus, so the learning curve is still developing. We don't know what the future holds. But what worries you the most? How concerned are you that over time we're going to see this as an ongoing public health issue?
Oh, absolutely. I think that was, for me, one of the biggest frustrations. So we have been, I would say, fortunate to have identified this pretty early on based on some measures that we had taken as Mount Sinai as a health system. We had this remote monitoring program for patients with acute illness, and we continued to follow them throughout. So we kind of had this heads up. The issue is, again, that it is so debilitating, and that's one thing that I really want people to understand. The age range of patients that seem to be suffering from this is 20s to 40s and 50s. So these are people who beforehand were relatively healthy, didn't have any major illnesses or comorbidities, and now they're, like I said, absolutely their lives have been turned upside down.
You know, I'm curious your take on the emotional toll on these people. I know there's some pretty big support groups out there. I think one Facebook group has 100,000 members, but I can imagine these people feel helpless, worried about the road ahead emotionally, let alone physically.
Yeah, absolutely. How could they not, right? When in our history, there's never been a time where you've gotten ill and you're unable to go seek out a physician for help. You've been told to stay at home, to isolate, to not talk to anybody, right? And so that in and of itself is anxiety ridden. And then afterwards, you're just presumed to have gotten better, right? So now you keep feeling these extreme symptoms, and so many of these patients, I should say, have gone to see so many different specialists. They've been in and out of the emergency department or the A&E, and all of the workup has come back negative, right? So because we don't know, and that's a really hard position, and I tell this to patients all the time, right? For both the patient and
이제 스쿼트를 해야
the
되는데.
healthcare provider. We're not used to being able to say, I don't know, right? And that's vulnerable for everybody involved. So the anxiety levels that go into this for the patients are absolutely sky high, but that's not what's causing the issue, right? So, but that just makes it worse, right? So being told that this is in your head, right? When it's not, you're having physiological symptoms that we don't yet understand based on a novel virus. But then being told that just makes it that much worse, which then exacerbates the symptoms. So it's more like a negative feedback loop, so to speak.
Dr. Dana McCarthy from Mount Sinai Hospital, really appreciate your time and really appreciate the work you're doing for that group of people. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
A top US expert is congratulating Russia on its COVID-19 vaccine research. Dr. Anthony Fauci says Moscow did the right thing in publishing early results on Friday. The report in the Lancet Medical Journal said that the vaccine produced antibody response in all study participants. CNN's Matthew Chance tells us how the vaccine effort and the report are playing at home.
In Russia, the battle against COVID-19, it seems, is being fought with real soldiers. This is the country's defense minister getting a vaccine. Then, on state TV, Moscow's mayor tells the Russian president he's just been vaccinated too. Did your temperature rise? A concerned President Putin asks. No, says the mayor, just a slight headache and a little fatigue. The intended message, Russia's vaccine, called Sputnik V, is safe. Even top officials trust it, although the Kremlin won't confirm to CNN if Putin himself has taken the plunge. But there is now some reason for Russia's confidence. First data from phase 1 and 2 clinical trials published in the Lancet Medical Journal suggests the Russian vaccine produced no serious adverse side effects. It seems to be safe, in other words. And it generated an antibody response, according to the Lancet, in all the test participants. Admittedly, only 76 people, but Russian scientists say that's more than enough to prove their vaccine works and works well.
The high level of cell immunity suggests there are great prospects for developing memory cells. This tells us that it will not just create high protective levels at the moment of immunization, but also that this protective impact will last for a very long time.
Russia has been one of the world's worst affected countries in the COVID-19 pandemic, recording more than 1 million cases nationwide. It also has a track record of creating vaccines, famously against polio in the 1950s, more recently in 2016 to battle the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. But there's been a cautious reception to Russia's COVID-19 vaccine, lack of published data until now, and approval for use before human trials were complete raised concerns about its safety and effectiveness. Even now, with phase 1 and 2 trials published, the Lancet warns the studies are too small and that larger phase 3 trials are needed to know how useful the vaccine will really be.
What we can say is that this new Russian vaccine, the results are encouraging, but it would be premature, highly premature, to think that this is the basis for a successful vaccine for public use.
That's not what the Russians want to hear. They named their vaccine Sputnik V after the Soviet-era satellite, which shocked the world by orbiting Earth. A global first and a symbol of Russian scientific prowess. The vaccine, it seems, is not quite there yet. Matthew Chance, CNN, Moscow.
You're watching CNN Newsroom. When we come back, a cargo ship goes missing in stormy seas. Now rough weather impeding search and rescue efforts. We'll have a live report when we come back.
The two men fighting for the White House.
I accept this nomination
For President of the United States.
Their triumphs and their tragedies.
This is what the end result is.
Is it true you keep Beau's rosary with you?
Keep it all the time. And their dramatic journeys to a final showdown.
This is our moment. This is our mission.
It's going to be only America first.
CNN Special Report. Fight for the White House. Tuesday on CNN.
On the next Living Golf, we take a closer look at the long game. What are the pros and cons of focusing play and distance? Hear from coaches and scientists.
A guy like Bryson, there's a lot of trial and error. How does he create the most speed, and how does he control the ball while still creating a ton of club head speed?
Plus, big hitter Padraig Harrington out on the range.
Join me, Shane O'Donoghue, working from my home of Ireland on this month's Living Golf.
Sunday on CNN, in association with Golf Saudi.
Pool testing. Many health experts say it's the necessary next step in testing and tracing COVID-19.
Instead of taking an individual nasal sample from somebody, you take a whole bunch of them and you put them together and you run a test on that whole batch. And then if it's negative, all those people are clear. But if it's positive, then you go back and individually test those samples to see who was positive.
The U.S. Food and Drug Administration issued recommendations for this testing strategy earlier this month, as companies and schools look to have mass screenings. Dr. Anthony Fauci says the White House Coronavirus Task Force is seriously considering this. Fellow task force member Dr. Deborah Birx agrees, saying pool testing is what is needed to get the testing numbers where they need to be. And she hopes this will eventually help people get back to their lives faster.
There are two things that are very important. The first one is that we need to have a coordinated approach. We need to have the governments talking to each other and working together. And that's one of the lessons that we have from the past. When you look at 2008, the financial crisis, for instance, the G20 platform was created, and that working together, that coordination was essential. So they need to define the frameworks for testing. They need to define some common practices. They need to define those standards first. Second is that if we learn from SARS, MERS, and Ebola, as an example, we were able to travel without a vaccine because we were able to isolate the sick people, right? This COVID is different, 80% asymptomatic. That's when testing, contact tracing is key. So we believe that we can travel. And there are countries that actually, they are doing that and they are recovering with testing, contact tracing.
Say the Japanese Coast Guard has temporarily suspended the search for dozens of missing sailors because of dangerous waves and strong winds from an approaching storm. The sailors were on a cargo ship that got caught in a typhoon. This was on Wednesday. That ship was carrying a shipment of thousands of cows from New Zealand to China. Only a few of the 43 sailors on board have been found. CNN's Will Ripley is following developments from Hong Kong. Not good news that the search being pulled back for now.
It is not good news, certainly for the families of these dozens of sailors who remain missing. We got confirmation from the Department of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines, their Japanese consulate, that the search for any remaining survivors has to be called off because the waves in this part of the East China Sea could be extraordinarily dangerous. When you see the photos of this ship that we're about to show you, it's massive. It is a converted cargo container ship known as an open livestock carrier. It allows the winds to blow back and forth so that the nearly 6,000 cows on board can get adequate ventilation, but it also makes them extraordinarily vulnerable to the winds like the ones that were happening on the day that this ship vanished.
A dramatic rescue off the coast of Japan. This Japanese Coast Guard vessel desperately tries to reach a man in the water, battling rough seas, getting closer and closer as the man bobs up and down like a cork. Finally, they're able to get him on board. They bring him onto a Coast Guard ship, warm him with a blanket, and give him water.
I'm only one. Yes.
He's a 45-year-old chief officer of the Gulf Livestock One, a cargo ship that went missing after a distress call early Wednesday near southern Japan. The ship was carrying 43 crew members and almost 6,000 cows, some seen dead, floating in the sea. The ship left Napier, New Zealand on August 14th, headed for China, a journey that was supposed to take 17 days. At the time of the ship's disappearance, it was being pounded by a powerful storm, Typhoon Maysak, the same strength as a Category 4 hurricane, with winds more than 200 kilometers or about 125 miles an hour. The chief officer told authorities the ship's engine failed. The vessel was hit by a wave and capsized. On Friday, a 30-year-old Filipino crew member was also found, clutching onto a ripped life raft 2 kilometers from Kotakara Island. Rescuers discovered a third man floating unconscious. He was later pronounced dead. The wife of the ship's chief engineer pleaded for officials to continue searching for the rest of the missing crew.
I would like to call on the Philippine government to give us legitimate information and strengthen their cooperation for the ongoing search and rescue operations.
New Zealand has since announced it's temporarily suspending exports of live cattle as it investigates what happened during the ship's journey. The export of livestock has been controversial. Animal rights groups have long called for the practice to be banned.
One of the reasons groups have called for the practice to end is because when the animals are traveling on those ships that are open air, essentially, they're really vulnerable to the conditions at sea that can be, as we are seeing in real time right now, extraordinarily dangerous. Michael, of the 43 crew members, 39 of them were from the Philippines, 2 from New Zealand, 2 from Australia. The 2 survivors' families have been notified. The other families just have
지금 몇 분이지?
Yeah,
몇
just
분 했죠?
terrible.
31분!
Thank you, Will. Good to see you, my friend. Will Ripley there in Hong Kong.
여기까지 하겠습니다,
Now,
오늘.
Typhoon Haishan is headed towards Japan and the Korean Peninsula.
허리가
It
너무
will be the 3rd major storm to hit the